after the seminar to ask questions and hang out and talk about tree rings, forests, and climate change with Dr. Evans. It's my true pleasure today to introduce Dr. Margaret Evans. She has an undergraduate degree in biology from Reed College here in Oregon. I didn't know that until recently. And a PhD in ecology evolutionary biology from the University of Arizona. Dr. Evans has held postdoctoral fellowships.
Sorry, Lucas.
Sure.
Could you speak up or turn your microphone up?
That'll be hard.
Okay.
I can speak up. Okay.
Margaret, we can hear fine, but you're really quiet. So.
All right. So let me try to project a little better here.
Probably Margaret's the important one.
How is that, Peter? Better?
Yeah, that's better.
So just to recap here, Dr. Evans has an undergraduate degree in biology from Reed College here in Oregon and a PhD in ecology and evolution from the University of Arizona. She held postdoctoral fellowships at Yale University and the National Museum of Natural History in Paris. And in 2018, she joined the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research as an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. This, for those who don't know, this is the leading tree ring laboratory in the nation, maybe in the continent. I don't know if Margaret agrees with that, but that's how I feel about it. She's a populational biologist by training, and she brings some really innovative approaches to demographic modeling, plant conservation, and evolutionary ecology in the context of climate change, and in particular, right, with some biogeographical questions and some truly innovative approaches to scaling fast processes such as plasticity and adaptation, acclimation to climate change, as well as considering the slow changing biogeographical rearrangements and evolutionary processes that underlie those adaptations. I have long followed her work in tree rings, and we eventually met in person a couple of years ago at a macrosystems biology PI meeting in Boulder. And I was really, really impressed by her new approach to tree ring research and integration of environmental data and ecological forecast, which is the topic of this talk today. So she'll be talking about forest, climate, and tree rings, forecasting the future state of complex systems. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Evans to our regular meetings, and encourage you all to stick around and ask questions at the end. Thank you very much. Margaret, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Lucas. I really appreciate that very warm and kind and generous introduction. And I will say the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona is the world's founding laboratory of dendrochronology. So tree ring science was invented here in Tucson, Arizona at the University of Arizona by an astronomer. That's a whole nother story. We're gonna set that one aside for the moment and move forward. So the context for the work that I do is this issue that we face. We are, in fact, in a climate crisis. And up until a couple of years ago, I sort of resisted the use of the word crisis, but it's really hard to stay away from that word at this point. And so specifically, we need to stay within some limits. At the Paris Climate Agreement, the agreement was made to limit the warming of global mean surface temperature to 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial baseline. And in order to reach that limit or not exceed that limit, we need to keep the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide below 450 parts per million. The problem is that we're already at about 415 parts per million, and global mean surface temperature has already increased by about 1 degree Celsius compared to the pre-industrial baseline. And we're going up by about 2 parts per million per year. And so the critical numbers here, and maybe I'll get my laser pointer here. So the critical numbers here are the 450, the 415, and the 2, and you put them together and they give you the number of years that we have left before we reach that critical 450 parts per million threshold, and it's not a very large number. We don't have a lot of time to really change course seriously. Now, a second thing that I want to point out in this graphic summary of the global carbon cycle over the period 2009 to 2018 is that the terrestrial biosphere has been mitigating about 30% of the excess greenhouse gases that we've been putting into the atmosphere. And so that's really the context and motivation for the work that I do. If you think about this means that there's this feedback between the terrestrial biosphere and the climate system. We know that climate influences the growth of individual trees, and hence their sequestration of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that forms this feedback loop. The other important context here is that there's a tremendous amount of scientific uncertainty about the future of the land carbon uptake. So carbon uptake by the land sector. So these are dynamic global vegetation models, and looking into the future, you can see how much they spread apart. And critically, the value 0 here, so models that have lines going up positive values indicate a carbon sink. So some of these models are indicating that the land will still be a carbon sink in the future. And then some of these models indicate that the land sector will be a source of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So in any case, looking at the units on this side, these are gigatons of carbon per year. So we've got 16, 18 gigatons of carbon per year of scientific uncertainty about the future behavior of the land carbon sink. So the work that I do is using tree ring data to get a better handle on this feedback. And that's really sort of at the heart of what I do. The other thing that I wanted to sort of introduce at the very beginning is sort of some words and ideas about what does she mean by complex systems or complexity. And so I'm just going to throw some words and some images and some citations at you just to give you a sense of the flavor of what I mean by complex behavior or complex systems. And you'll see these come up through the talk, these issues of tree growth being driven by multiple drivers that act on different scales and then interact with each other. The idea of feedbacks, we saw that in the previous slide, non-linearities in drivers and also in the responses to those drivers. We can think about these stabilizing feedbacks and alternative stable states. Some other stuff, sort of catchphrases from the macrosystems literature. Lucas mentioned that we met at a macrosystems PI meeting, and this literature has really strongly influenced my thinking. And then I'm just going to throw a couple of sort of seminal citations in terms of classic citations in ecology that think about scaling in ecology and the potential that there is for surprise in the behavior of ecological systems. I'm also going to toss this one at you, which is a much more recent paper and one of my favorites in terms of thinking about why changing scales can reveal ecological surprises, and thinking about the science of scaling up from our observations to making predictions about ecological systems. So what I'm going to attempt to do today is describe to you 3 different lines of research going on in my research group. One, the first of these is using tree rings to predict future tree growth. And I'm going to talk about this issue of space for time substitution. In the second line of research, I'm going to talk about demographic range modeling, which Lucas mentioned, sort of biogeographical aspects to some of my research. And that's this part of the talk will focus on this question of what governs or determines the ecological niche and the geographic distribution. And really, especially, is climate enough? These kind of climate envelope models, are they enough to give us good predictions about species' future geographic distributions with climate change? And then in the third section, I'm going to talk about combining together 2 really complementary sources of information on forest dynamics, tree ring data, and forest inventory data to improve our forecasting of forest carbon dynamics. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. So if you're not super familiar with tree rings and what they're used for, they have traditionally been used to reconstruct past climate. So you have, this is the horizontal axis is meant to indicate time. You have a time series of tree ring widths, the growth ring widths. That record goes backwards in time. And then you have a period over which you have the instrumental climate record, weather stations, et cetera, that overlaps with that time series. You use statistics to then associate the variation in ring width with interannual variability in climate. And that then allows you to reconstruct climate previous to the period during which we have the instrumental record. So this can give us very long records and really an incredible insight into paleoecology and the behavior of the climate system on longer timescales than we have in the instrumental record for. So then we can apply the same kind of principle to take future climate products, projections of future climate, and then this same kind of statistical relationship where the time series overlap to make predictions or projections of what the growth of trees should be like as climate changes. And so in this case, the climate is the predictor and the ring widths are the response variable. So there's a couple, this seems like a great idea, right? But there's a couple of problems with this. The first problem being that tree ring data historically have been collected from really climate sensitive individuals on the landscape. This sort of the classic way of doing dendrochronology is to find the most climate sensitive individuals on the landscape because you're interested in reconstructing climate variability. Whereas if your questions are about the future behavior of forest ecosystems or forest populations as a whole, you want an unbiased or representative sample of the trees in the forest, not the most climate sensitive ones. So since 2015, my group has been collaborating with John Shaw in the US Forest Service, the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. Essentially, what happened is that they rediscovered a collection of thousands of increment cores, about 20,000 increment cores, that had been collected across the interior West. And this is the map. It's not the most up-to-date map, but it's a map showing each of these locations as a place where we have an increment core, at least one, collected in forest inventory plots. They were collected between the mid-'80s and the mid-'90s. Justin DeRose is also used to be Forest Service, now Utah State University. These are the two folks who initiated this, and then I got involved in this and have been working on generating the data from the state of Arizona. And so very briefly, I'm just going to highlight a paper. The first paper that came out of this work was really to quantitatively demonstrate the difference in climate sensitivity between the tree ring data that are collected in that forest inventory and analysis plot network, the forest inventory trees, compared to the International Tree Ring Data Bank. And so indeed, it turns out that you can show that the ITRDB trees are more climate sensitive. You can see the amplitude of the variation is greater for the black line than the red line. And the consequence of that is that if you look at projections of future growth for the FIA data, you get less of a reduction in growth based on these less climate sensitive individual trees, sort of what I like to call the Joe Schmo tree in the forest. Okay, now this second problem is that, the idea is that we're using the past to predict the future. And the statistical relationship between climate variability and growth variability in the past to predict what the trees are going to do in the future. And everybody knows that extrapolation beyond the range of data that have been used for calibration is a dangerous thing to do. So you can think of this picture right here as, maybe some sort of high latitude forest. So this is an example where growth is positively sensitive to temperature. So should we expect the sensitivity of tree growth to be positive regardless of how much we turn up the temperature? That is, really sort of So what I'm going to very briefly talk about here. So the solution that we took in this 2016 paper, Noah Charney led this paper published in Ecology Letters. We basically sort of broke the forest biome up into pieces and said, okay, let's use space for time substitution to predict how trees are going to grow as the climate changes. Fast forward a couple of years, I was involved as a co-PI in a USDA AFRI grant proposal led by Carolyn Copenhaver. And my task as a co-PI in this project was to do this kind of forecasting, prediction of the future growth of trees, in this case, Douglas-fir. And as you all know, this is a species that is incredibly important commercially, has this enormous geographic distribution that actually goes further south than than what I'm showing, has this incredible ecological amplitude in terms of the climate space that it occupies in terms of mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation. So our task was then to predict future growth for this particular species. And in particular, the difference between this paper and the previous one that I just showed, the Charney et al. Paper, is that we were interested in predicting absolute ring widths, not relative ring width. So rather than ring width index, it's absolute ring width, because we're interested in these kind of carbon related questions. So the questions that we addressed in this paper focused on Douglas-fir, we asked, are the average width of growth rings and climate sensitivities predictable across environmental gradients, this vast environmental space that is occupied by Douglas-fir? And what I'm showing here is this classic figure from dendrochronology, sort of a incredibly important figure in dendrochronology. Hal Fritz published this paper in 1966, where he shows that across this gradient, environmental gradient from a forest interior, think Arizona here, forest interior to the semi-arid forest border, so getting warmer and drier, you have average ring widths going down, so productivity going down, and then sensitivity to interannual climate variation going up. And I've gone ahead and just cut to the chase here, because I'm trying to summarize, 3 different lines of research here. I'm not even going to show you the statistical models that we used, or even the data network, which was enormous. The bottom line is Fritz was right. The predictions that he made were right. So productivity and climate sensitivity vary in opposition against each other. So trees growing in very productive environments are less climate sensitive. Trees that are growing in less productive environments are more climate sensitive. Does that mean that these are then substitutable? Can we use these predictable patterns as a basis for space for time substitution? And the conclusion that we came to was no, that we can't use the growth of a tree at a warmer location today to predict how a tree at a cooler location today is going to grow in the future. And before I get into the explanation of why and how we came to that conclusion, I just want to give, apologies. I did want to show you this figure from the paper. So this shows you in a very abstract form what the statistical model of the analysis of that data network across the entire geographic distribution of Douglas-fir showed us. So there are 3 patterns that I want to highlight. First is that as mean annual temperature goes up, the average growth rate, that is the solid lines here, increases. So you have higher growth rates in warm places. A second point is that comparing a warmer location to, a drier location to a wetter location, you get higher productivity at wet locations than dry locations. And so that's looking at the effect on average growth rate of mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation. And then these dashed lines show you climate sensitivity in response to interannual variability in temperature. And so you have a positive response to spatial variability in temperature at the same time as there is a negative response to interannual variability in temperature at each location, at each given location. This is one of these examples of complexity in ecology. When you look at different scales, you actually get a response that is different in sign from positive to negative. All right, so if you were going to apply space for time substitution to this figure, what happens with climate change is you move to the right on this x-axis. So temperature warms. And if you follow this response, you end up predicting that a tree at a given location in a warmer future is going to grow more than it does today, following this, this response here, even though it's actually responding to interannual variability in temperature negatively. So there's something wrong with this prediction. This is what clued us into the fact that there's got to be something wrong here with the idea of using space for time substitution. So I'll get to that in a moment. I just wanted to give you a second example, which is not published. This is unpublished work. You know, maybe Douglas-fir is unique or strange in some sense that it has this enormous ecological amplitude. Let's take a look at this in a second species, and in particular, in a species, piñon pine, Pinus edulis, that is at the arid edge of the forest biome. Do we still see a positive response to spatial variation in mean annual temperature in a species that is sort of a desert pine or a semi-arid tree? And so here's what this is, as I said, unpublished work led by the engine in this work is Sharmila Day, who she actually had just finished high school, and she spent COVID on a gap year before starting college. She worked on this project with an incredible team of people mentoring her. Two postdocs in my lab, Emily Schultz and Kelly Heilman, and also a Bayesian statistician, John Tipton. So we all worked together with Sharmila, you know, meeting with her every week, and she generated, I'm just going to show you this one plot, which essentially shows you the same pattern that we saw for Douglas-fir. So on the y-axis here is predicted tree growth in absolute growth, in millimeters, and then on the x-axis in each of these is it's actually anomalies of mean temperature in this April, May, June season, the sort of arid foresummer is what we call it down here. So you see a negative response, so less growth in years that have warmer April, May, June period. And then we've broken this, we've colored the lines by mean annual temperature, and then we've broken up all the trees in the data set into driest locations, somewhat dry, and then somewhat wet, and then the wettest locations. And so the highest absolute growth rates are places that are warm and wet. And the lowest growth rates, you can sort of see these blue lines kind of, they're kind of underneath the red lines here, and they're still at the bottom here, and they're still down here. They're just the trees are at the coolest locations, which tend to be the highest elevation. They're just not as responsive to more precipitation. And it's the trees that are at warmer locations that are able to respond to, you know, getting more precipitation. All right, so that's as much as I'm going to say. So we've seen this pattern twice now in Douglas-fir and in Pinus edulis. So let's take a moment to re-examine the logic of space for time substitution. So the idea in space for time substitution is that the processes that are giving rise to spatial variation are the same as those giving rise to temporal variation. Therefore, we can substitute them. And the classic example of this, of course, is old field succession. We don't need to wait 100 years after an agricultural field has been abandoned, to know what plant community is going to show up there and what it's going to look like 150 years from now, because there is this ecological process called succession that is going to take you from a plant community that looks like this to a plant community that looks like this. So now when we apply this idea of space for time substitution to this global change prediction problem, it's not so simple. So the idea was to substitute geographic variation in the growth of the tree across its geographic distribution to predict how the growth of a tree at a given location is going to change given temporal change over time of the climate itself. The problem is that this geographic variation in growth patterns across the distribution are the result of evolutionary processes of adaptation over time. And the process that's driving this temporal change that we want to predict the response to is climate change. And these are on different time scales. And so it's just not appropriate to substitute the outcome of evolutionary adaptation plug that into making predictions about climate change. And so the take-home message from this part of the talk is that when we make ecological forecasts, we need to match the time horizon over which we want to make predictions of the behavior of this ecological entity with the processes that are relevant or operating on that timescale, and we need to use appropriate data sources to make those forecasts. So in other words, specifically in this case, near-term forecasts, that is decade scale, up to 2100 forecasts of tree growth, they should reflect norms of reaction or plasticity of the genotypes that are on the landscape now, not the spatial patterns of growth variation that are a result of local adaptation, which are outcomes of these evolutionary and or migration processes. I just want to highlight very quickly that this was articulated very nicely in a paper published in the Ecosphere by Peter Adler and co-authors in 2020. So if we had more time, I'm not gonna spend the time to walk through this, but they've articulated this really nicely in this figure in terms of the forecast horizon, the drivers, the biotic processes that are operating on these different timescales, and the kinds of data that should be used to make ecological forecasts. I do recommend this paper. Okay, we're moving on. So the second line of research that I want to talk about is what I call demographic range modeling. This is a project that's spearheaded by a postdoctoral fellow in my group, Emily Schultz. And she did just an incredibly fantastic job at taking on a very challenging project and really making it work. Okay, so the idea here is, what is it that controls ecological niches and geographic distributions? We have some very, very old ideas in ecology that climate, at the scale of a geographic distribution, that a species geographic distribution, that climate really is the only factor or the most important. It's the overarching, the dominant driver of what determines a species geographic distribution. And I could cite any number of papers. There are many lines of evidence supporting this. An alternative hypothesis, which equally has a very, very long history in ecology, is that maybe where we see species is not just because the climate is suitable for them there, but also that they haven't been excluded by competing species or other kinds of biotic interactions that might exclude them. And this is, really going back to Hutchinson, G. Evelyn Hutchinson, and the idea of the fundamental niche and the realized niche. And a relatively recent paper sort of framed this as the species interaction abiotic stress hypothesis, that you have abiotic stress at one end and biotic stress at the other end, sort of shaping species distributions. And it matters a lot, especially, as I made a little reference to earlier. We've been making a lot of predictions about what will happen to biodiversity under scenarios of climate change using climate envelope models. So climate only, very correlative and sort of phenomenological models. And that's appropriate if climate really is the only thing that is determining species distributions. And it may not be appropriate if that's not the case. So we took a demographic approach to evaluating these competing hypotheses for species geographic distributions. So the idea is to explicitly model these demographic processes that ultimately underpin or underlie the abundance and distribution of species that we see on the landscape. These are the demographic processes that determine population sizes, their fluctuation through time, geographic distributions. So we model these processes explicitly as a function of climate and competition. And we fit alternative models, climate only, and then climate plus competition as influencing these demographic processes. And what do we get out of that? So the data were derived from the US Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. The demographic model that we fit these data to is called an integral projection model. This is sort of a continuous state variable version of, if you've had course in ecology, you may have been introduced to a Leslie matrix or a population projection matrix. And so IPMs are sort of the continuous state variable version of that. So they look at from the lower limit of tree size to the upper limit of tree size. The IPM kernel has these two components, which is growth conditional upon survival, and then fecundity, or the production of new individuals in the population. So those three basic demographic processes, birth, death, and growth, are encapsulated in this demographic model. And the IPM kernel then projects the number of X-sized individuals at time t forward to the number of Y-sized individuals at t+1. So we're just projecting size distribution forward one step in discrete time. Bottom line, out of the discretized version of this IPM kernel, you get the predicted asymptotic population growth rate. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next slide is lambda. So this is a map of predicted population growth rate. The color scale here, the white is the value 1.0, which is the replacement rate. So at a value of lambda equals 1, individuals are replacing themselves on average over time. So this is lambda predicted given mean annual temperature, mean annual precipitation, and a map that we made of the basal area of trees based on FIA data for the whole study domain. So we build the demographic model looking at how mean annual temperature and precipitation and basal area of trees influence growth, survival, and birth of individuals, new individuals. And then we use maps of those same drivers of demographic variation to predict the suitability of the landscape. And that's essentially what you're looking at. The color scale here is predicted suitability, predicted by this demographic model. The points are locations where Pinus edulis is present. And so then to validate this model, we ask the question, at those FIA locations, at the locations of FIA inventory plots, Pinus edulis is either present or absent. So we can use a logistic regression that uses the model predicted lambda at those FIA locations and compares the probability of occurrence of Pinus edulis at those locations. So what we should see is that as the demographic model predicts higher and higher lambda population growth rate, we should see increasing probability of occurrence of Pinus edulis. So the model's doing nicely here. We're seeing this nice increase of the probability of occurrence of Pinus edulis with increasing model predicted population growth rate. And then all of a sudden, we have this pattern here where the demographic model is predicting population growth rates that are above that replacement value of 1, but the species is not present at those locations. And that's, really what you see in this empty blue area, right? So we've got values of lambda that are greater than 1, but the species is not present there. And I'll also point out some of these areas, we put in these isoclines of 3,000 meters. So high elevation locations that are predicted to be suitable according to climate and competitive conditions, but the species is absent from those locations. And then I'm very briefly just going to show you, we did this for, as I said, a model that's calibrated with only climate as a driver of demography, and then also a model where climate and the competition index or proxy is included in the model. And then we compare their performance in this, logistic regression, this validation. And the model with climate plus competition performs better. It fits the data better. So that's, supporting the idea that both climate and competition are, influencing the geographic distribution. But if you look at the residuals of those two models, they have very similar patterns. So the orange and the green are those two competing models, climate only, climate plus competition. So the next thing that we did was to do some perturbation analyses. There's a particular kind of perturbation analysis that demographers use called a life table response experiment. And without going into the gory details, the question that we're asking and that we're answering with this perturbation analysis is, in the places on the landscape where we have predicted high lambda, is lambda population growth rate predicted, is it a high value because the model is predicting high survival or high growth or high recruitment? And I've just cut to the chase without, going into a lot of detail. The answer is where you have higher than average predicted values of population growth rate on this map, it's because you've got high predicted survival, or down here in the desert, low predicted survival. And in terms of the environmental drivers that are underlying that spatial variation in demography, it's temperature that's really driving that. And so here's my summary of the different kinds of perturbation analyses that we did of the demographic model. For this long-lived organism, unsurprisingly, population growth rate is most sensitive to survival. So trees, if you reduce the rate of survival of trees, that will affect the population growth rate tremendously more than if you reduce the growth rate or if you reduce the rate of recruitment. And this is actually fairly unsurprising. And then it turns out that temperature is really the strongest driver of variation in survival. So that's what I'm indicating with the thickness of the lines. And that's what we see coming out of the model. And actually, that's what I want to sort of illustrate here. In this figure on the x-axis, you're looking at elevation. And with elevation, temperature varies, in a very sort of physical science kind of way, adiabatic cooling. In addition, mean precipitation tends to vary with elevation also, so that you have at lower elevation, warmer and dry and less productive. And at higher elevation, cooler and wetter conditions, and also higher basal area of live trees, right? And the gray bars here indicate the elevation range over which Pinus edulis is absent. So you go up to a little bit higher than 1,000 meters, and then you have this range of elevation where Pinus edulis is present. And then an elevation range above which Pinus edulis is absent on the landscape, but our model is predicting population growth rates that are above that replacement value of 1.0. So our demographic analysis provided more support for the climate plus competition hypothesis than the climate only hypothesis in terms of we do see negative effects of biotic stress of competition on growth rates, the growth of individual trees. But population growth rate is not particularly sensitive to the growth rate of individual trees. What it's really sensitive to is temperature, is survival. And what survival is sensitive to is temperature. And so the negative effect of competition as you go up in elevation is just too weak to offset the positive effect of climate. The climate is getting better as you go up in elevation. And biotic conditions are getting worse, yes, but it's not enough to offset the positive effect of climate. So we haven't been able, we put in both climate and competition to explain the species distribution, and we were unable to explain it. So that suggests to me that these classic hypotheses that we have for what governs species distributions are not adequate. They're insufficient to explain species distributions. So,
Margaret, can I ask
yes.
a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think it fits right here where you talk about model inadequacy. And seeing your previous figures where your model disagrees with the data, it seems that most of the disagreements happened towards the northern latitudes, if I'm not mistaken. And I was just wondering how confidently can you rule out the effect of dispersal limitation in leading to an absence of these trees up there, especially considering glaciation history in North America?
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. You're dead on. And we have excellent paleoecological data from people like Steve Jackson, Kenneth Cole. We know that pines, well, they were before the Anthropocene, before the warming started, they were still migrating north. They were still recovering. Their distributions were still recovering from the last glaciation. You're dead on. You're absolutely right. And I would agree with you, above a certain latitude, this is probably dispersal limitation. But however, within the domain of where this species does occur, but we have these really steep elevation gradients. And remember, piñons, these are piñons, right? So they're dispersed by birds. And birds can travel those distances, as the crow flies, or as the blue jay or the nutcracker flies. These are very short distances that elevation varies. And so I don't think that you can explain that, the absence of the species from these places. But it's an excellent point, and you're absolutely dead on about that. Yeah. So I'm gonna move on to the other explanation, and dispersal limitation is definitely part of this picture. But the other part of the picture that I want to highlight is a missing process, which is fire. So I just very quickly, I'm going to do my little thing here. Evolutionary biologists like to say that nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I would argue that nothing makes sense except in the light of a very good understanding of the natural history of the organism that you're studying. And so look at this, published in 1993, published in 1998, fire, the importance of fire in determining the distributions of pines in particular. Look at this, the desertic pines, essentially the piñons, they are intolerant of fire, which is probably the primary control on their upper elevation distribution. So it's been sitting there in the literature. So that's what we explored in a set of stochastic simulations of demography. Emily did this in incredibly short order, just in time for the ESA meeting in 2020. She put together these stochastic simulations in phenomenally short time frame. And I don't have I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through these. But she basically applied stochastic fire regimes that are characteristic of a series of plant communities, the pinyon juniper woodlands themselves that Pinus edulis is found in, and then a couple of sort of adjacent vegetation types. So she pulled fire frequency probability distributions based on the tree ring literature, actually the fire scar records. And then she did stochastic simulations of population growth rate. Without fire is the black bars across these different communities, taking into consideration the climatic conditions and the competitive conditions. And then she added fire, stochastic fire, and the mortality, the rates of mortality that are seen in the forest inventory data, the FIA data, to the demographic models. And look at this. I mean, it's like phenomenal. When you add fire to the picture, you have low frequency, high severity fire in these pinyon juniper communities. That brings the population growth rate right down to about 1, the replacement rate. And in these other community types where you have high frequency, low intensity fire, the predicted population growth rate is now well below the replacement value of 1. So it's suggesting that Pinus edulis is excluded from these communities by fire because it is a fire intolerant species. So I'm going to wrap up this part of the talk with the happy news that this paper is now in the production phase. So it should be appearing in Ecology Letters sometime soon, maybe in the next few weeks in the early online view. But the idea that we've put forth, so we've sort of said, look, folks, it's not just climate, and it's not just climate and competition. It's more complicated than that. The controls of species geographic distributions include the direct effects of climate, yes, on demography, but also indirect effects of climate mediated through, in this case, the control of climate on the biotic community, the feedback between vegetation and disturbances like fire, and then the direct effects of fire on demography. In addition, pine beetle, insect outbreaks have also had a huge effect on pinyon, and we're arguing that cross-scale interactions between regional drought and this sort of small-scale biotic trophic interaction between the focal species and its natural enemy can also have really strong effects on the geographic distribution. So the picture in terms of what controls species geographic distributions, it's much more complicated and much more dynamic than can be captured by these climate envelope models, and that the predictions of these climate envelope models really are probably insufficient to make very good predictions. Okay, I'm going to just not even tell you, we have more stuff that we want to do with these first 2 lines of research, a grant proposal that I submitted over the summer. Fingers crossed, if we get the money, then we can really put these things together and do this on a multi-species scale for all pines in the Western US, including the tree ring data and stochastic simulations of fire. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the third part of the talk. So ecological forecasting. As Lucas hinted at the beginning, this is sort of a major focus of how I think about doing science and how I think about what are the mechanisms by which we can get better at understanding and predicting ecological systems. Ecology desperately needs to become more predictive. And the problem is that these systems are very complex. And the idea of ecological forecasting is to borrow some inspiration and some statistical tools from numerical weather forecasting. And this case has been laid out very nicely by Mike Dietz in a book that he published. And this is sort of the paper that came out in PNAS a couple of years ago, where he makes the case for this approach to improving our science, the science of ecology. And Mike is in fact a collaborator on the project that I'm going to talk about, that is funded through the NSF Macrosystems Biology Program. And Kelly Heilman is the postdoc who's been doing just a spectacular job at this project. So what we're doing is we are applying 3 of the principles of ecological forecasting to this problem of predicting future growth of trees. So 3 ingredients in particular that this project focuses on, which are bringing together 2 complementary sources of data, the tree ring data and the forest inventory data, using new data that come in the forest inventory. They are out there every year measuring trees. Just like numerical weather forecasting, they can make a prediction about tomorrow, and then the weather data come in, and they can compare. Well, how well did I do at predicting the weather? Because they're always bringing in new data, and forest inventories are doing the same thing. They're bringing in data every single year, so we can make predictions about the growth of trees next year, and then we can compare. Okay, they went out and measured the trees. How close did we get? And then a third principle, tool in the toolbox of ecological forecasting is forecast uncertainty quantification. So quantifying where is our uncertainty in our forecast coming from. Looking at the time, I'm just going to I'm not going to be able to go into a great deal of detail about the model, but it is a Bayesian state space model, and the state variable in this model is the diameter of the tree. So diameter at breast height, so the bole diameter is the state variable. And if you think about dynamical systems and the mathematical models that people use to model dynamical systems, you have ordinary differential equations, partial differential equations, and then you have difference equations, meaning that we're just making predictions with treating time as discrete. So we have discrete measurements of the diameter at breast height of trees. So this is our difference equation that governs our dynamical system. We're predicting the change in size of the tree through time. And then the increment is then modeled as a function of all of these factors, an intercept term, a plot random modification of that intercept, an effect of the size of the tree at the beginning of that time interval, the precipitation that the tree has experienced, the temperature, stand density index, which is again a proxy for competitive pressure, site index, which is a forestry metric, of sort of site level productivity, two-way interactions, and all the other two-way interactions. So we have this process model, and then we have 2 observation error models that allow us to reconcile conflicts between the data. It's possible in a forest inventory to actually get DBH measurements that are either the same or even less than the DBH at the measurement at the earlier time point. So you need a measurement error model to be able to reconcile those kinds of conflicts between the 2 data types. I'm just going to, sort of briefly go into some of the take-home messages out of this model. So tree growth is a complex process. We have multiple drivers influencing the growth of the tree at the same time. These are factors operating at different scales, and then they also have there are significant interactions between these effects. I'm going to kind of skip through some of the. Okay, so tree growth is complex. Confronting the model predictions with data using both in-sample and out-of-sample validation revealed some trade-offs between fit to calibration data versus generating more forecast uncertainty. You can fit the calibration data even better, but you're going to generate more forecast uncertainty. Another trade-off between the best model for predicting tree diameter was not the best model for predicting diameter increment. The forecasts indicate widespread future growth declines, not surprising. This is a tree species that is negatively sensitive to interannual variability in temperature. And then I think I'm probably not going to have enough time to talk through the lessons that we learned about uncertainty quantification and what paths it points us to in terms of being able to improve model skill and improve our ability to forecast the growth of the trees. So I see that it's 1:10, and so I'm going to skip the last part of the talk where we built the climate sensitivity of tree rings into FVS, the Forest Vegetation Simulator, which is it's a management tool that for the forest that's used across the Forest Service, and it's also a carbon calculator. It forms the basis for calculating carbon credits on the carbon market. And we built, my master student Courtney Giebink built the climate sensitivities of tree rings into FVS. And then we also are doing a collaborative project with the Navajo Forestry Department to provide to them a climate sensitive version of FVS that they can use for their management purposes that's based on tree ring data collected in their continuous forest inventory plot network. So I'm going to come to my closing slide here. So lessons learned. In terms of predicting the future growth of trees, we can't use space for time substitution, and near-term forecasts of growth, they need to be based on time series data, and they need to reflect the norms of reaction or plasticity that are encapsulated in these tree ring time series. And we can't use that space for time substitution. From the second project, the bottom line here is that these climate envelope models are probably insufficient to make predictions about how biodiversity is going to respond to climate change. And then in the third section, really, it's just sort of, we got it done. We built this really cool ecological forecasting pipeline that brings together the strengths of these tree ring and forest inventory data. And with that, I'm just, want to thank you all for your attention and everyone who's been involved in this research, quite a few people, and the sources of funding. And I'd be happy to take any questions with the time that we have left.
So glad we could hear some clapping at the end there. This is kind of new these days. It's refreshing. Thank you all.
There's people out there.
Margaret, thank you so much for amazing talk and comprehensive explanation of this whole thing. The breadth of your research is really astounding. I'm really stimulated by this talk, and I would like to invite everybody who has questions to ask them. I have a couple of my own. I'll save them. Anybody willing to ask a question at this point?
Yeah, I do see Monica has a question in the chat window. Monica, that's a great question. That really is the leading edge, or the and Lucas knows this. I mean, tropical trees are not always well behaved in the sense of generating growth rings every year that are easily recognizable. That's absolutely true. These kinds of tree rings analyses are really much more amenable in the temperate zone. That's absolutely true. Yeah. And it's not that it can't be done. It's just harder work, and you're a little bit more limited in terms of species. Maybe some species are going to be a little bit easier and more amenable to it than others. Maybe you could take the approach that you take the amenable species as like indicator species for those communities. Yeah.
I see that Skylar has his hand up there.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Hi, Margaret. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
That was a great talk. Thank you. Something that I didn't catch it, but what do you think the role of increased atmospheric CO2 is going to play on tree ring models, particularly with doing future climate projections? And did you account for that in any of your work? And do you have any thoughts of maybe how reliable it is to use tree ring data to kind of model something like that?
Yeah, there's lots of people down here who have thought about this, and I'm surrounded by a lot of conversations about these issues. So my understanding of the literature is that the tree ring data doesn't show the expected fertilization effect on growth, but the tree ring data does show increased water use efficiency in terms of the isotope signal in tree rings. And so there's a disconnect between, yes, we get the increased water use efficiency, but no, we don't get the increased growth. At least not growth in terms of what, above ground woody biomass. And sort of like, where's the carbon going? Like, where's the missing carbon? People talk about maybe it's going below ground, maybe it's going to the fungal symbionts in the soil, maybe it's getting spit out as root exudates. That's sort of where the mystery is at this point. There's that Walker et al. Paper that came out in New Phytologist where they tried to reconcile all the different lines of evidence about the CO2 fertilization effect. I think that tree ring data could be really useful in terms of playing an important role in kind of inverse estimation of a process-based model that better represents the process of tree growth at a whole tree scale, rather than a leaf scale model of photosynthesis and gas exchange. I think we need a model that represents the entire balancing act of a homeostasis that a tree has to do, that tightly coupled exchange of carbon and water. There are these tight physiological feedbacks that the tree can adjust stomatal behavior according to VPD, atmospheric demand, and how does that there's this debate between source limited and sink limited control of growth, and I think that tree rings could be really, really useful in constraining a process-based model, potentially in sort of including forward and inverse estimation of the parameters in a more complex and physiologically realistic model of growth.
Building on that really briefly here. So 2 questions in one. First, how good are these models at predicting longevity for your species of interest? Are we good at predicting longevity, lifespan in general, which should be one of the key variables here, especially for the carbon story? And second, is there room for biogeochemical niche, that may be useful to explain the response or lack of response to CO2? Is there room for other elements and the cycling of nutrients in soil, for example, to be built into these models? Have you all been thinking about this? Is this part of what's next? Thank you.
Those are 2 really big questions. I think the first one is easier to answer. The question about longevity, these IPM models, like if you've done a good job as a demographer at parameterizing your IPM, you're gonna make checks on, what is the expected passage time or expected, sort of population level parameters about longevity and senescence and things like that. And so, I feel confident in saying that Emily did a fantastic job at doing those checks in terms of fitting the Pinus edulis data to the IPM. So if you've done a good job as a demographer, then you're going to come out with predictions of longevity that should be reliable, actually. There are some fine-tuning issues that we actually did see in this case. We could go into the weeds if you really want to hear about it, Lucas, but it's kind of a demography geek thing. The issues that Emily that she did run into, and that it has to do with the fact that you do have measurements of diameter that are smaller at time t plus 10. Remember, these are 10-year intervals for the forest inventory censuses. You actually get DBH measurements that are smaller at time t plus 10 than they are at time t. And so, and in Emily's model, we did not implement a measurement error model. So we did that in the Bayesian model. Emily's demographic model, we did not do that. And so you actually end up, once trees get really, really large, the increments, the increments actually go below 0. And so you end up having trees, it's sort of a demography geek kind of thing that, yeah, maybe Jeff would appreciate this too, but we feel pretty good about how we parameterize the model. There's definitely more that can be done in terms of like getting that measurement error model in there and doing a better job at that. But
to be clear, then longevity is not one of the big unknowns at this point, right?
Correct. Yeah, we're getting predictions that we feel like are reasonably, they fit the observations. You know, we're not getting outrageous predictions. Yeah, and then your second question is a much harder question. And actually, can you remind me your question? Biogeochemical cycling, something.
Biogeochemical niche, right? Biogeochemical niche theory. If there's a room for considering that here, because you're looking at niche in various scales and space.
Are you thinking about? Are you talking about the sort of demography driven?
Things like progressive nitrogen limitation
models.
Progressive nitrogen limitation by B1 one
example
is applied to this case.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you one possible answer, which is you know, CLM, the community land model that NCAR, you know, they have all these different variants of CLM, and one of them is CLM Fates. And CLM Fates is like the demography version of CLM. And so one dream, one dream possibility is, can we get the forest inventory and the tree ring data built into CLM Fates? Can we constrain the behavior of CLM Fates with forest inventory data? And this is like really zooming back, like there's like so many different kinds of forest models, right? And they kind of vary from really empirical, like FVS, to much more process-based, like the DGVMs. And, it would be like the downside of the process-based ones is that, you can get the right answer for the wrong reason. You've got so many processes packed into CLM. How do you even know whether you've got the processes right? How do you diagnose this thing? If we can use a little bit of that empirical data to constrain that process model a little bit more, that would be awesome. So I don't know if that was what you were asking, or if that's kind of.
I agree with you. I just want to say that many in this room will probably agree with you again that ecology desperately needs to get more predictable, and we need to advance ecological forecasting. I see Peter with his hand up there. Peter.
Dan has a question. Let's see.
Yeah. Is my voice going through?
Can you hear him?
Can you hear me?
Not so great.
Oh, okay. I know this is working. Yeah, really enjoyed all this. The question back to the first part about space for time substitution.
Okay.
My voice going through? Oh, okay. With the space for time substitution, you are finding that you can't use space for time looking at temperature across temperature gradients. And I'm wondering about the choice of climate variables for that kind of study. Temperature is one way to describe the climate, but I guess this follows on Skylar's question a bit. Not CO2, but moisture balance, maybe having a more linear relationship with growth and distribution. For example, vapor pressure deficit's been shown to have the same relationship on plant growth across geography or soil moisture, or actual evapotranspiration estimates, or things like that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we kind of went back and forth in terms of, like, if you only put one climate variable in there, maybe it should be like, Palmer drought severity index, like a drought index of some kind, something that integrates together temperature and precipitation. So I think, there's sort of two fundamentally different ways of like trying to get at this, right? One would be, I'm going to put temperature and precipitation in there and look at the interaction between them. Explicitly model a statistical interaction between them. The alternative would be, I'm only going to put drought index in there, and I'm going to, I better have like the possibility of a nonlinear response. So we went with the former, and we do, we really clearly do see, the interaction between the two. Yeah, so does that answer your question, or at least begin to answer your question? Like,
so you are seeing interactions between the variables.
We do see, and yeah, so we really strongly see an interaction between temperature and precipitation, such that, especially in that Pinus edulis figure that I showed you with the 4 panels, with like driest, a little, somewhat dry, somewhat wet, and then the wettest locations. The model predicted tree level responses to temperature are negative everywhere, but the absolute growth rates are highest at places that are warm and wet. And they're consistently low at places that are cold. And whether it's cold and wet or cold and dry, they're lower at the colder places. So, that figure was, I felt, more convinced after seeing that figure than with the Douglas-fir study. We actually put in a huge number of climate predictors. We put in the monthly temperature and precipitation values for 18 months worth of 2 and 3 month windows. So it ends up being this super complicated multiple regression model. And I really started to feel a little bit nervous about, like, when you build a model that has that many climate predictors in there, like, how squishy is this whole thing becoming?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And interactions between the climate normals and all of those, different time varying seasonal temperature and precipitation. And so in the Pinus edulis model, we took a much more pared down approach. And you still see that same positive response to the main effect of mean annual temperature is positive, even for a desert pine. Like, that's what was really surprising to us. But yeah, I mean, if I don't have my extra slides with me, and that there's a nice map of mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation for Pinus edulis. And it turns out the warmest places are also the wettest. And that's in the south, because in the southern part of Pinus edulis' geographic distribution, you have the Mogollon Rim, where there's a stronger influence of the North American monsoon, and you're at a more southern latitude. And so Pinus edulis goes from relatively warm and wet in the south of its distribution to then occupying up in Utah, actually colder and drier and higher elevation.
Yeah.
I don't know, that's kind of a long rambling discussion. But I think, at a like a zoomed out scale, it's not surprising to me that the main effect of mean annual temperature on plant growth is positive. You get highest growth rates in warm places, and those growth rates are not going to be as high in a dry, warm place compared to a wet, warm place.
Right. And that's the variable that we were forecasting. We're not forecasting moisture balance very well, but we are forecasting temperature well.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, everything hangs in the balance between the two, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have any other questions from the room? Somebody at home? I see that Hillary Rose may be poised to ask a question there. No, no, okay. There's the camera on. I saw Skylar raise his
In the
hand.
chat. Yeah, Armando asked. Yes.
Oh, should I look at the chat window, guys? Oh my gosh, I forgot to look at the chat window.
Yeah, Armando Gomez Guerrero, our collaborator from Mexico, asked a question about addition of wood density as another variable in the model. Is that a thing?
Yeah, you know, I mean, honestly, like ring widths are not the only thing, not the only kind of information that we can get out of tree rings for sure. I haven't really, that's a great question, Armando, and I haven't really thought that through. Like, you know, if we were to put maximum late wood density in there as a variable, what does it inform us about? I think I would need to think through the physiology, you know, what does that reflect? Which honestly is something that you have a better handle on than I do. Can I turn the question around and ask you, Armando?
Well, actually, the question is because it was very interesting, your point. If we have to use the information from the forest inventory, because there's a lot of samples that could come from the inventory analysis. So I think the way the three rings are getting is very different. As you said, is very different. If I want to make a model to predict the precipitation or temperature is different. If I want to get three ring samples to see how the forest is growing. So my question is about the density is because maybe if we combine at the same time the real numbers of the tree rings and wood density, which in some way means cell wall, maybe we can improve the model in terms of getting more information about carbon sequestration, the point that you are looking at. That's actually, I don't have a response for that. I was asking your opinion.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I was saying in response to Schuyler's question about, CO2 fertilization and the idea that tree ring data could play a really important role in parameterizing a more physiologically informed model of tree growth. And not just the ring widths, but, the isotope data and the density data, like the quantitative wood anatomy is literally, those are the dimensions of the conduits through which, water is traveling. And, looking at the variability of that from one year to the next. I think it would be really interesting to try to bring those different sources of data together in a more process-based model of tree growth that's not just like this leaf level photosynthesis gas exchange kind of thing.
Okay.
I want to follow up real quick here. Armando, first, it's great to see you. You look younger every time I see you. It's great to see you. And we've done a lot of isotope work together. Margaret, you may know this, and it's amazing how useless isotope data is to predict tree growth. And after doing dozens of these things, we can't really begin to predict. Water use efficiency always goes up with CO2, right? We see some consistent responses in oxygen isotope ratios as well, in cellulose and whole wood. Delta 15N, another thing we look at in nitrogen deposition gradients. All of that fascinating stuff for the biogeochemical niche hypotheses. All of it useless to predict phenology and tree growth. And yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I'm beginning to think we should move away from the isotope stuff when it comes to predicting the kinds of things you're predicting.
Well, maybe, you know, the isotopes are like, that's the buffer, you know, like that homeostatic game that the tree is playing. Like, what can I do to, you know, keep my conditions within the boundaries of life? You know, I can adjust my stomata. I can, yeah, I mean, that sort of physiological adjustment that's being done is reflecting the buffer, that all that buffering act that the tree does. And so, yeah, I don't know if you, what I'm trying to get at is that like the trees, because it's done such a good job at buffering, it's able to grow, and it grows more or less the same. And so it's been maybe you need to push your trees harder. Like you need to like stress them out a little bit more.
Which brings me to another question. Are you doing experiments on this? Are you working with experimental plots and maybe some of the face sites? Is there experimental data on this right now?
I'm not. I am involved in a grant proposal. In fact, I have a deadline today on that grant proposal that would involve some experimental data. I'm not an ecophysiologist. I like to work with ecophysiologists. I would love to, you know, like kind of put these ideas into practice. The like field work that I've done has actually been this collaborative project on the Navajo Nation, where you know, the downside of the forest inventory collection of tree ring data, like the map looks great, right? You like purple dots everywhere, fabulous, but it's only essentially one core per plot, more or less. And so this Navajo collaboration, we're collecting increment cores from every single tree above 5 inches diameter in the plot. So then, you know, we have a record of all the trees on the plot. And it also gives us hope to get at the fading record problem, which is, you know, a huge issue for calibration, you know, let alone like reconstruction or forward projection. And so the data set that I'm personally working on building is a better forest inventory based tree ring data set where we have every single tree in those plots sampled for increment cores. Yeah, so that's where like my personal fieldwork effort is in that project.
That's very cool. Thanks for sharing all that. I see that Dan is poised to ask a question there, right?
Yeah. I was like, ooh, every tree core. I'm going to stop recording at this point.
Oh, sure.
Oh, right before Dan's question? Come on.
Yeah, no.
I don't know. How good of a question is it, Dan? Well,
just kidding, Peter. Just kidding. Just
like we're going on there. Thanks anyway. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye, Peter. Thank you, man.
Okay.
I might stick around, but I'm just.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah. No, I just.